Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Marzoff, the Integrated Services Program Director at VITA, and I'm happy to welcome you to another of our Webinar Wednesday series. Today, we'll be talking about the annual report that the board will approve at their September meeting. It is annual requirement that we do this, and it's one of a couple major things that the board will be considering at their September meeting, September 14th meeting. The others are the PSAP funding formula, the PSAP standard capabilities and services standards document that's been developed, and then the annual report, which includes our legislative agenda for the year. So Dorothy Spears-Dean, the ISP director, or the Public Safety Communications Coordinator, will be doing the webinar today. I'll be helping out a little bit when we get to legislative stuff. But again, a final reminder to please mute your phone to cut down the background noise. If you do have a question, please feel free to interrupt and ask it, because as always, these webinars are for you and your information. If you don't get the question answered, then it wasn't a successful webinar. So we want to make sure we answer all your questions that you may have. And with that, I will turn over to Dorothy to start. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Thanks, Steve. Just want to confirm that everybody can see the presentation.
Yes.
Great, thank you. As Steve said, the purpose of today's webinar is to give our local government constituents an overview of this year's annual report. A draft copy of the annual report will be available from the ISP website in a couple of weeks, around the middle of August. This document still needs to be reviewed by VITA's finance and communications staff members, but we wanted to share with you the content of the report as soon as it was available. The purpose of this webinar is to review with our local government constituents the content that is contained in this report, particularly the 911 Services Board's legislative agenda for the upcoming General Assembly session. And Steve will be providing a legislative overview later in the webinar. The Code of Virginia requires the 911 Services Board to report annually to the Governor, the Senate Committee on Finance, the House Committee on Appropriations, and the Virginia State Crime Commission on the items listed on this slide. My presentation will focus on the state of E911 in the Commonwealth, the board's 2018 legislative agenda, and the need for change in the 911 funding mechanism. The last requirement has to do with multi-line telephone systems, or MLTS. Beginning on July 1st, 2009, MLTS providers are required to maintain and operate the MLTS in such a manner that a 911 call made from any telephone on the MLTS is routed to a PSAP. Virginia is one of only 16 states that has enacted MLTS legislation, and the board continues to monitor MLTS developments. This report, or this year's report, is all about Next Generation 911. NG911 is a solution based on a modern IP network that has the ability to deliver calls to the appropriate PSAP faster, transfer 911 calls and associated data anywhere needed, interconnect with other public safety systems and databases, and securely receive multimedia communications like text, photos, and videos. NG911 represents the future, and the board is actively engaged in implementing NG911. This new technology is based on the National Emergency Numbers Association's, or NENA's, I3 solution. This is a functional standard, and it is not a build-to standard, but it has become the de facto industry standard. ISP staff estimate that it will take about 5 years to transition Virginia PSAPs off the selective routers and onto an emergency services IP network, or ESINet. These developments will occur regionally. Identifying the transition order for Virginia PSAPs will be based on the paired selective routers, not the integrated services or ISP region. This order has not yet been determined, and it will not be determined until we have a solutions provider. Throughout fiscal year 2017, the board has had a number of accomplishments the majority of which directly support NG911. And you see 4 of these accomplishments listed here on this slide. The Regional Advisory Council, or RAC, and ISP staff developed a cost model to capture and estimate the non-reoccurring NG911 transition costs. These costs were estimated to be $69 million. This model provides the financial foundation in the board's plan for implementing NG911. The RAC conducted an analysis of the operational, administrative, and technical staff functions required in each PSAP. The result is an initial report that provides recommendations on professional competencies for each function to support NG911. With best practices, ISP staff facilitates the development of documents, and the RAC serves as the steering committee. This year, 3 best practices were produced. These best practices are 911 addressing, public safety call processing, and wireless 911 call routing optimization. The RAC also developed a standards document describing the current standard capabilities and services all Virginia PSAPs must provide to their citizens. The RAC, assisted by ISP staff, also released a survey to Virginia PSAPs to obtain budgetary information. The purpose of this survey was for the RAC to gain insight into what localities spend to support standard capabilities and services. ISP staff plans to use the data collected to help determine the cost of 911 in Virginia, as well as to identify any potential financial gaps that would impede the deployment of NG911 in the future. Moving on to the second slide for 2017 achievements. The first one, deployment statewide of the Emergency Call Tracking System, or ECAS reporting tool. This tool has been deployed statewide, thus enabling consistent, comparable data analytics. 2 other accomplishments that I'm going to spend a few moments talking about. The first one, refocusing of the PSAP grant program to help fund NG911 deployment, and the second, continued commitment to the statewide deployment of text to 911. And I've devoted a slide to each of these 2 remaining achievements. In March 2017, the board made the decision to use the PSAP grant program almost exclusively to provide funding to localities for next generation NG911 non-reoccurring costs. These costs include setting up the ESI net, GIS data preparation, and transitioning PSAPs off the selective routers and to the ESI nets. The application cycle for the fiscal year 19 grants opened on July 1st of this year, and the guidelines for this funding year include priorities related to these items, as well as the replacement of any remaining critical 911 equipment that is no longer supported by its manufacturer. However, after this grant cycle, and with the guidance of an NG911 solutions provider, this grant program will transition to a multi-year funding program that's focused solely on implementing NG911. Regarding text to 911, there have been 30 deployments of this service in Virginia, and this service allows citizens to report emergencies through text messages, which is critical to the hearing impaired community. Many more localities are planning to provide this service to their citizens, in conjunction with upcoming call handling equipment, or CHE, upgrades and replacements. Funding is available through the PSAP grant program to deploy this service. One of the reasons the board felt very strongly about including funding for text to 911 in the grant guidelines is it has been identified as a next generation 911 core service, or an NGCS. And this brings us to the discussion, the next topic, the legislative agenda. And at this point, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Steve.
Thanks, Dorothy. There's really 4 things we're trying to accomplish with our legislation, and none of them really adversely impact the localities. In fact, the first two of them there really benefit and help the localities by providing funding or freeing up funding for Next Gen 911. But we do want to make sure you understand what you're trying to do and also what some of the concerns from the carriers are, because we'll likely need your help as we move forward with this, especially reaching out to your local legislative representatives and to promote the changes that are being made. Simply put, Next Generation 911 is estimated that will cost $69 million over 5 years to deploy, and we're trying to be able to free up the money to be able to cover that so that there aren't any new allocations of funding needed from the localities in order to move forward. The first and one of those ways of freeing up money is to get rid of carrier cost recovery. Currently, the code requires 30% of the fund to be set aside for cost recovery for the carriers. Now, they're not getting 30%. They're actually probably only getting about 10% or a little less than 10% of the fund is going to the carriers. The rest is going to the compensation board, which then goes to the localities for funding of sheriff's dispatchers. But that $4 million-ish or so dollars that's currently going to cost recovery over the next 5 years will generate $20 million to put towards that $69 million. As you might expect, not all the carriers are thrilled with the notion of losing the cost recovery, but we are planning a summit with the carriers in the next few weeks in order to sit down with them and try and work out a compromise. The second is that all carriers, wireline and wireless, would have to provide the call to the point of interconnection, which is to be defined by the board, where those points of interconnection would be at no cost to either the PSAP or the Commonwealth. Now, the voice over IP carriers already have to do this by an FCC regulation that says they have to deliver the call to the selective router without compensation. This would be expanding that to the other types of carriers. We believe it's the right thing to do since the carriers, there is disparity among the carriers. Wireline is entitled to receive funding through the tariffs. Wireless is entitled to receive funding through the board, and voice over IP isn't entitled to receive anything. We think this is a leveling of the playing field and is appropriate to do. I will tell you, we have gotten some pushback from some carriers on this one who believe it may be what's called a taking, where government takes property or a service from somebody without compensation, which is against the Constitution. So it is something that we have to work on with them and try and figure out a solution to make sure we don't run afoul legally with the Constitution or anything like that. So again, on that summit that we're going to have with the carriers, we're going to try and work out some sort of a compromise. But essentially, many of the carriers are already doing this, and one of their big concerns is where these points of interconnection are. During a pilot we did at one point, we had them in Durham, North Carolina, and I believe the other one was in Colorado or something. And one of the small carriers, I'm talking one of the co-ops, Citizens in Floyd County, would have incurred a pretty substantial cost of $3,000 a month for only 150 customers. So that's unreasonable, and I think that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that there will be those high costs. So, the selection of the points of interconnection location is going to be really important to make sure that the board puts them in such a way that it doesn't cost the carrier large sums of money to be able to interconnect to them to get the calls to the 911 network. And then the final thing we're doing is just codifying that priority in the grant program should be given to Next Generation 911. Some of the original language we looked at, we said it had to be dedicated to Next Gen 911, but we did soften that language back to a priority given to Next Generation 911 when the board added back in computer-aided dispatch for fiscal 19. We wanted to make sure we that softer language made it easier for us to comply with that and just giving a priority to Next Generation 911. So, again, none of this really impacts the localities greatly except freeing up local funds that you currently pay Verizon or CenturyLink or anyone else for that 911 connectivity and that sort of thing. And to be clear, the part of it where Verizon and CenturyLink are the 911 service provider, from the selective router forward, the selective router, the ANI, the ALI, databases, and so forth, that's going away no matter what, because of the next generation solution provider will take that role. Of course, it could be one of those two, but if it isn't, that would change no matter what. What we're talking about here is the part getting it to the 911 network, and there is part of that money that you pay CenturyLink and Verizon and potentially some of the CLECs that covers that cost, and that's what we're talking about getting rid of. So, that's in a nutshell what we're looking at doing this year. And again, we may be calling on you. The board has not approved the final language, so don't go yet talking to your legislators, and unless you have a good relationship with them and want to just give them a heads up. But in September, when we have the final legislation from the board, we will likely reach out to some of you and ask you to reach out to your legislators, especially on key committees, to help us push this legislation through and get it approved so that we can get the money we need to deploy next gen. Dorothy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Moving on to funding and E911 services. Although the retirement of the current analog network has already been discussed, the impact that this event will have on Virginia PSAPs cannot be overstated. The transition has the potential to create a significant financial burden to the Commonwealth and local governments. To minimize this burden, the board has developed an NG911 Funding Strategy. But before I discuss this strategy, I would like to review how the wireless E911 Fund is used today. The fund is generated by a 75-cent monthly surcharge collected from each wireless customer whose place of primary use is in Virginia. The amount of revenue received in fiscal year 2017 was about $58 million. The current funding process for distributing the revenue collected through the surcharge is to distribute the majority of the fund based on a predetermined formula derived from PSAP cost and call load data. The Division of Public Safety Communications, which I manage, a portion of the Virginia Geographical Information Network, VGIN, and centralized billing agreements for PSAP wireless 911 services that Steve has already mentioned with the legislative discussion, are supported through the fund. Since this funding is contained in the Appropriations Act, it is subtracted before any other funding distribution is made. The current funding process distribution distributes 60% of the fund to the PSAPs. 30% of the fund is earmarked for wireless services provider cost recovery, and then the PSAP grant program utilizes the remaining 10% allocation of the fund, as well as any remaining funding. So for fiscal year 2017, the amounts that I have here are for the total amount of funding received by Virginia PSAPs. This total is $36,974,468, and this is from the 60% of the fund that generated $28,105,932. And then PSAP grant awards for this year, $8,867,536. The wireless service providers received $2,343,007 in cost recovery, and these amounts have not yet been certified by Vita Finance, but they are contained in the draft copy, so I wanted to share them with you today. The $36 million amount represents a 0.5% increase in the amount of funding that PSAPs received in the past fiscal year 16. Another area that's mentioned in the annual report that I'd like to touch on now quickly is the funding committee. Now, we had a webinar, it was last week, to talk about the work of the funding committee. I'm not going to spend nearly that much time, but just a minute or two to run through what has been captured in the annual report related to the funding committee. As you're aware, at the January 2017 board meeting, the board established a funding committee to make recommendations on changes to the PSAP funding formula. taking into account the best interests of statewide 911 services and Virginia local governments. The formula that was used is used by the Virginia Department of Taxation for the past 5 years to make monthly payments to localities is based on cost and call-load data from 2007 to 2012. If the existing formula is adopted by the board, is applied using cost and call-load data from the localities for the last 5 years, it will result in a significant shift of funding among the localities. So the funding committee got together, analyzed the results, and is recommending a new formula that's based on total 911 calls and population. This data still produces significant shifts of funding at the local level, but the committee felt strongly that this data is more appropriate to use in determining local 911 funding as the Commonwealth transitions to NG911. And this is a slide that we have included at numerous meetings, and this is the NG911 Funding Strategy that the board has adopted. The board's NG911 Funding Strategy coalesces funding from other priorities into the PSAP grant program. The board is planning to authorize network improvement funds in the PSC budget for NG911 grants. And as PSAPs transition off the selected routers, the board would redirect funding from the wireless E911 billing agreements to the PSAP grant program. This strategy also includes borrowing from the Treasury to maintain a positive cash flow during the deployment years. So on this slide, the top line that has the title NG911 deployment cost, this row depicts the $69 million in transition costs that Steve mentioned. And then if you come down to the next series of rows, you'll see the billing agreements, the network improvement lines, and then these coalesce into the line between both of these, the PSAP grant program. As you can see, there would be a number of years where we're in the red. That's why the recommendation is there to borrow from the state treasury. That is depicted in the second row from the bottom and has $30 million in deployment year 3, fiscal year 2019. Now, that's not to say that we would have all of the borrowing coming to us in that year. It's just a way of capturing that amount to show that we need the borrowing authority to have a positive cash flow, which you see in the last line. More than likely, that the borrowing would be based each year on needs, and there would be payback during the deployment period. We're also depicting in this funding strategy slide post-deployment years 22 and 23 as when we would be able to completely pay back the amount of funding borrowed. The ability to receive federal funding is addressed in each year's annual report. The Appropriations Act for the current biennium budget continues the transfer of $3.7 million to the Virginia State Police and the $8 million transfer from the wireless E911 funds to the compensation board to pay the salaries of sheriff's dispatchers. Federal law enacted in 2008 provides that state expenditures of 911 charges are to be in support of 911 and enhanced 911 services. These transfers may impact the Commonwealth's ability to receive federal funding in the future. Virginia Code does not mention the transfers to the Virginia State Police or the Compensation Board specifically, and if the transfers are determined to be non-compliant, or diversion, this would impact the Commonwealth's ability to receive federal 911 grant funding in the future. And that determination will be made by the federal government. So that is an overview of the 17 annual report. When we started out, we said that the 911 Services Board would be reviewing and voting on this report at their September 14th meeting. We will be posting the document to our website about 4 weeks prior to the September board meeting. We still have some internal review to undertake, but in the meantime, we felt it was important to share the contents with our local government constituents before we actually published the report. So what I'd like to do now is to ask the webinar participants if they have any comments or questions related to this report, any any thoughts on the legislation, funding committee, any topics covered in the webinar today.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question. This is Eddie Vick with Sussex County. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Just a quick question is that I think we understand how you all derived at the formula. Is that pretty concrete? You know, Sussex, of course, we're taking a $30,000 hit. Is that you guys any way to change that to where it lessens our impact a little bit, or is that pretty much in concrete as we speak now?
The impact that you're referring to, this is the impact that's contained in the latest spreadsheet to show the impact of the hybrid funding model from the funding committee?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That's right.
We will be hosting an additional funding committee meeting. It is scheduled for Monday, April the 21st from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. I have not yet sent out an agenda or a meeting announcement, but that meeting is in the works. The purpose of that meeting was for our local government constituents to provide feedback. We've already had the webinar on the funding committee work, but certainly your question is great, and it's an opportunity for me to let you know about the upcoming meeting.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, all right. Well, thank you, ma'am.
And Dorothy,
Thank you.
this is Steve. I think it's important to note that the board will vote on that formula at that September meeting. So you have between now and then, and if not this, then what is the real question. So there are a lot of significant shifts in funding in this formula. The funding committee selected it because they felt it was appropriate to reflect the amount of work and the amount of cost in NextGen, because NextGen costs are, at least from what we've seen, are based on population. So as a result, the population and the call load to take the amount of work, when you look at those two things, call load, 911 call load, I should say, and the population, they felt was the fairest or best way of looking at it going forward. If it were to be something else, the question then is what? And, you know, one option is don't recalculate at all and change the code to take out the recalculation. The committee did consider that and felt that that wasn't appropriate because the old formula really wasn't based on anything really that reflected work. It really was based on more how much you spent, and they didn't feel that was appropriate to continue that model. So, you know, we've had a few suggestions from people wanting to look at work population or daytime population, employment numbers. We've had some people suggest maybe looking at college population, that colleges may be disadvantaged because they have a large population that comes in that isn't counted as part of their base population. Basically, both of those are ways of looking at population that isn't permanent population that would be counted in the I think it's Weldon Cooper numbers that we would be using. So if you want to suggest a change, my suggestion would be to come with another solution to that meeting, or you can send it to us ahead of time and we can circulate it around and talk about it some as well. So nothing's in stone yet. It won't be until the gavel comes down at the September 14th meeting of the board. You're absolutely welcome to participate in the meeting that Dorothy mentioned. We will also be having a webinar with county and city managers and administrators from VML and VACO are promoting on the 16th of this month to try and make sure they know what's coming as well, so that if you do have to go to your city manager or county administrator and say, hey, we're losing $20,000 or $30,000 or whatever next year, that they're not surprised and wanting to know what is Richmond doing or what did you do wrong. We want to make sure that they understand what brought this about, why it's being changed, and then give them an opportunity to also provide alternatives or other suggestions as well.
Yes, sir. We kind of, you know, I guess my question was how you derived at that, but it seems pretty fair. You know, so obviously we'd like more money. I'm sure everybody would too. So, but at least we have an understanding of how we derived here, and we certainly probably would like to participate in the process which you guys have offered, and we will certainly. Thank you.
No problem. We welcome it. Any other questions for Dorothy about anything that's in the annual report, which, since it's supposed to really be a kind of a review of everything that happened last year, basically, do you have any questions on anything that happened last year? Going once? Going twice? All right, well, we thank you for your time today. We want to make sure, one of the things that when we did our last satisfaction survey, which, by the way, we'll be doing again here in the next week or so, to all of you, asking how well we and supporting the board do our job. One of the things that we were asked is to be more transparent and provide more information. So these webinars were designed to do that and to give you everything you need. I have had a few people say that it might be a little too much stuff, but there is a lot going on right now, and we want to make sure everyone is aware. We've got the formula recalculation. We've got the new standard coming out. We've got next generation 911 deployment. We've got the legislative changes. We've got true up. We've got a grant window that's open. I mean, we have got a lot going on right now, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, because we're going to be gearing up to start doing next generation 911 deployments. Northern Virginia is getting ready to sign the contract, or Fairfax sign the contract for Northern Virginia. And then we're going to look at how do we roll it out through the rest of the state based on what we've learned through that process. So it's going to be a busy summer and fall. If you have any questions, I mean, ultimately you provide the service. We're just here to support you. And we want to make sure that you have everything that you need to be able to do that. So if there aren't any final questions, we will have future webinar Wednesdays coming up. Like I mentioned, the one on the 16th, which is more geared towards city managers and county administrators. You're more than welcome to listen into those. We will put out an announcement that, but it will be the same information that we've covered here today and that we've covered in the prior webinars as well. So thank you all for your time. You get a half hour back, and if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to your regional coordinator, Dorothy, or myself. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.